Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're clicking in from. Welcome to our webinar on the transition to a 1.5C future. My name is Dustin Liu. I'm calling in from New York, and I'm currently serving as the 9th U.S. Youth Observer to the United Nations. I am so thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate today's event, where we will be exploring where 100 of the world's most influential oil and gas companies stand. We are gathered here today during the high-level political forum on sustainable development, a crucial moment for this conversation, given that it's the annual checkup on the 2030 agenda. This week alone, nearly a quarter of the world's countries will be undergoing voluntary national reviews on the progress that they have made on the SDGs. The topic of today's event resonated with me given the conversations that I've had with young people around the world who have so accurately described a rhetoric-reality gap. We're seeing statements of change from corporations, but where is the action? I've learned from these conversations that climate change is top of mind for young people and can often feel like a paralyzing issue. Thought leadership like the oil and gas benchmark we will be exploring today provides a systemic pathway forward and illuminates levers that we can pull to realize a greener, more sustainable future for us all. The UN Secretary General has called the climate crisis and transition to net zero an epic policy test where the private sector has a crucial role to play. And today we have an opportunity to see how those crucial sectors are measuring up. It goes without saying that an intergenerational approach is crucial, which is why I'm so delighted to see that we have an intergenerational audience here with us today. It will take collaboration across silos to ramp up accountability, counter greenwashing, and facilitate a reimagining of our systems. In the United States, with the recent heat dome in the Pacific Northwest, which resulted in temperatures as high as 46 degrees Celsius and literally melted away infrastructure with it, we are seeing the impacts on climate crisis in real time. And the oil and gas benchmark arrives at a critical moment in time when pressure is mounting on the sector to make fundamental changes. This includes the International Energy Agency's recent call for a rapid transition away from fossil fuels and a period of pivotal legislative and shareholder action against major companies. While industry heavyweights have long expressed their commitment to becoming more conscious, the benchmark findings reveal a glaring lack of progress, and the companies find themselves at a crossroads: transform or be left in the race to net zero. Today, we will start by examining the key findings from the benchmark's assessments before welcoming four leading figures to help us contextualize, digest, and explore the findings. We'll be joined by Baptiste Perrizon-Faber, Executive Director of Expertise and Programs at the French Agency for Ecological Transition, Patrick Heller, Advisor at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, Tim Gold, Head of Energy Supply Outlook Division at the International Energy Agency, and Nicolette Bartlett, Executive Director at the CDP. As promised, we'll first be hearing about some key findings from the gas and oil benchmark from the World Benchmarking Alliance. The World Benchmarking Alliance was launched in 2018 because there needs to be real change in the way business impact is measured to boost motivation and stimulate action for a sustainable future for all. The World Benchmarking Alliance identified 7 transformations that need to take place to put society and the worldwide economy on a more sustainable path to achieve the SDGs. And to turn these transformations into action, WBA develops, in collaboration with the Global Alliance, a series of benchmarks assessing 2,000 of the world's most influential companies, ranking and measuring them on their contributions to the SDGs. To present these key findings, I'll be passing the virtual stage over to Vicky Sins, who is the lead for decarbonization and energy transformation at the World Benchmarking Organization. Vicky, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dustin. I'll be sharing my screen. So, like Dustin said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are. And at today's webinar, where we explored that, of course, the links between climate change and the businesses are becoming more and more important and also evident. Decisions that the private sector is making will impact the speed of the decarbonization that the world needs to see. Insight into how industries and the most influential companies within those industries are performing is pivotal to assess the credibility of their performance in this transition. But the private sector cannot do this alone. In this low carbon transition, all stakeholders from the investor community, public policymakers, civil society organizations, as well as the companies, they need to be involved and they need to collaborate. That's why it's great to see over 100 participants today from various organizations and to listen to today's webinar. The question today is no longer if there is a need to address the climate crisis, but more how are we going to address it? We have seen increased momentum in companies setting net zero commitments, but do these companies really know what is needed to get to that net zero commitment? With just 10 years to go until the intermediate deadline in 2030 that was set in the Paris Agreement, we must ensure that we're advocating and driving for truly transformative change. That's why the World Benchmarking Alliance Climate and Energy Benchmark is the true accountability mechanism that measures corporate progress against the Paris agreements and whether the companies are contributing to a just transition. As Dustin already said, today we will be looking at where do the 100 most influential oil and gas companies stand in the transition to the low carbon future. In this new era of energy production, oil and gas companies are at a crossroad. They need to either transform or they will become redundant in the future. They can no longer plead ignorance of how urgently this change is needed. The industry must acknowledge the wholesale transformation that is required to survive and to signal the steps it is taking to meet this challenge. The ACT oil and gas company, the oil and gas methodology, is assessing the organization's readiness to transition to a low carbon economy, and it uses future-oriented indicators. The ACT assessment places a particular emphasis on 3 key areas: whether or not the company is aligned to a low carbon future across the targets that they've set, and we look at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We look at the future projected emissions and the intensity across the full value chain. And we also look at whether companies will be contributing to low carbon business models. We are using the recently published IEA 1.5 degree scenario in this oil and gas benchmark. It is really our goal to drive action by companies, investors, policymakers, and other stakeholders to truly encourage the businesses to move to a 1.5 degree compatible pathway. The goal is to have benchmarked 450 companies across various high-emitting sectors by 2023. And by adding this 100 oil and gas benchmark, 100 oil and gas companies, we're reaching 180 assessments till date. So today we will explore the 5 industry key findings after completion of the ACT assessments on these 100 oil and gas companies. Next week, Thursday, on July 22nd, we will publish the full ranking, including the scorecards of each company's online. Please keep an eye out on this publication, as it will show on an individual company level what is needed to contribute to get this industry on a low carbon transition path. For the oil and gas industry as a whole, we have found the following 5 key findings. First of all, we see that the industry as a whole is breaching the 1.5 degree scenario. And in order for these companies to have a future business model that fits within a 1.5 degree future, it means that these companies must keep the oil and gas in the ground. The findings show that the production from already approved oil and gas fields of these 100 companies will burn through and breach the 1.5 degree carbon budget of the whole sector by 2037. Despite this trajectory, the most influential companies in this sector are going the opposite direction. It looks like they're taking a take what you can while you can approach, but these companies must transition away from oil and gas, not just to keep our planet safe, but also to ensure their own survival in a low carbon economy. The research shows that the industry is using what we see as a strong smoke and mirrors tactic. We see companies are deflecting the attention away from their inaction and ineffective climate strategies to avoid true accountability over their role in this low carbon transition. This is supported by the fact that they report that the climate change is managed at the board level, but only 5 of the 100 companies are found to have the needed expertise to truly address the challenges that climate change is posing to this industry. This actually means that 78% of the companies do not have the relevant expertise at board oversight level to truly make this transformational shift that is required under the 1.5 degree scenario. So we see that the company's current climate change strategies are largely ineffective. So rather than rising to this challenge, they are actually using a lack of transparency and engagement and are engaging with trade association to undermine true climate action. So the full data tells us that the greatest contributors to climate change show no recognition of the emissions responsibility that they have. This is evidenced by the fact that the majority of these companies are non-transparent or have unambitious or even non-existing targets for the future. The strategies from these greatest contributors to climate change show that they're not accepting their responsibilities for the overall global emissions. Particular scope 3 emissions are the biggest source of emissions for the sector, and some companies see their scope 3 emissions that are equivalent to some of the emissions of whole countries. But our analysis evidences a systemic lack of scope 3 accountability, because we actually see that only 3 companies are having a comprehensive emission reduction targets, which is highly insufficient. So a low carbon future for this industry is not only about decarbonizing the existing assets, but as I said, it's also that it needs to show sufficient commitment to invest in low carbon technologies to support this transition. This research looks at data that shows that the company's capital expenditures in low carbon technologies should be sufficient to support this low carbon pathway. But the data shows that this is not nearly enough. Despite that these companies state that they have low carbon commitments, companies aren't walking the talk. The scenario analysis and investment in a low carbon future is shockingly low across these 100 companies. Only 30 companies are reporting their proportion of CapEx for low carbon and mitigation technology. But the whole sector requires that 77% of total CapEx is invested in low carbon technology to align with the 1.5 degree scenarios. The current rate shows that it's only 7% that is being invested, which is highly insignificant and entirely insufficient to decarbonize at the scale and the pace that is required. So the last finding I want to share with you is the following. The oil and gas sector's impact and risk are not confined to publicly listed or privately held companies. State-owned companies produce around 2/3 of the world's oil and gas and own about 90% of the global reserves. Companies with state ownership perform the worst out of these 100 companies. This poor performance is an even bigger risk to climate change. State-owned companies account for a large volume of the emissions, and we see that many of the states involved have made no commitments to net zero emission, and there is limited ability for non-state actors to push for change. That's why I'm very excited to hear more from Patrick Heller later on in this webinar about the need to include the national oil companies in the decarbonization strategy that we have for the world. I realize that the conclusions of our reports are very stark and the messaging about action required is forceful. We need this very important sector to significantly increase its ambition and to be held accountable for their role in this decarbonization. As announced, next week, Thursday, on the 22nd of July, the full research will be made available. This will include a full rating and ranking, company scorecards, extended key findings, and performance module summaries. Additionally, tomorrow, the WBA will release its Just Transition methodology. This will be used to assess these high-emitting companies on their contribution to not only a decarbonization and energy transformation, but one that leaves no one behind. Because if that's not managed well, the transition could be prevented or result in both stranded assets, stranded workers, and even stranded communities, which presents systematic risks for companies as well as investors. Ultimately, the transition to a low-carbon society will not be successful if commitments to implement social standards are not prioritized alongside commitments to decarbonize. The full assessments of using this Just Transition methodology will be presented at COP later this year. And we are looking forward to your continued engagement. And for now, I hand back to Dustin.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for walking us through those key findings and for your leadership in curating these insights. The research and findings are certainly stark, and I'm excited to pivot over to our esteemed panel to share their insights on what we just heard. So we'll invite first Baptiste Parison-Faber, Executive Director of Expertise and Programs at the French Agency for Ecological Transition. How are you, Baptiste?
Very good, Dustin. Thank you.
Lovely to have you here. And I'd love to invite you to start with a high-level question as we start exploring these findings. For you, from your perspective, what are the biggest opportunities and challenges facing the sector today?
Well, thank you for the question. And first, thank you for the invitation of ADEME in this panel. ADEME is the French EPA. So we provide public and private actors with expertise, methodological tools, and financial support boost the ecological transition in France. And I'm particularly pleased to be here for the pre-launch of the first international benchmark produced by WBA on oil and gas companies using the ACT methodology, because when I look back in 2015, during the COP21, when we first launched the ACT initiative with CDP, at that time, we strongly believed that we were going to need a strong accountability framework to appraise companies' commitment. And actually, at that time, we heard that we needed to be cautious. We needed to not afraid too much companies with the challenges ahead, because at that time, we needed to encourage them to take commitments. And well, we listened to the advice. But still, we developed a robust methodology to both debunk greenwashing and also provide tools to companies for implementing low carbon strategy. And 6 years later, here we are. Many companies have taken commitment, net zero commitment, but very few of them have taken it seriously, implementing a consistent strategy to meet the climate objectives. And here comes the very powerful impact of the benchmark approach developed by WBA, making it possible to discriminate and rank companies according to their actual efforts to shift toward carbon neutrality. So we are extremely happy to contribute to this effort. Now, regarding your question and the oil and gas sector, well, the big challenges ahead for them is quite clear. The message from IEA is very clear. No more investment in new fossil fuel resources. So the biggest opportunity for oil and gas companies is to move from the problem side to the solution side. And the levels of action are very well known also. First, providing energy efficiency solutions, increasing behavior changes for end users, accelerating electrifications, developing hydrogen, renewable energies, deploying CCS technologies on existing assets, and investing in carbon sinks with nature-based solutions. All those levels are well identified in the ACT methodology and have been shared and discussed with companies and experts from the oil and gas sector. And actually, most of them have started to implement some solution. But given the urgency of the climate threat, the challenge now for them is to deliver the solution at the right scale and the right speed. And actually, oil and gas companies have less than 4,000 days to completely reverse the trend. And it won't be a quiet journey. There are many barriers ahead to overcome. Just to mention some: low prices of fossil fuel, weak carbon pricing, in spite of interesting move by EU Commission on this topic, strong lobbying from a business union, and fossil fuel subsidies that are very hard to phase out in some countries. And this is exactly where benchmarks data come in and can accelerate governments and regulators' action. I can develop a little bit if I still have time. So yes, for government action, benchmark data are critical, because based on robust benchmark results, government can design and implement a targeted carrot and stick policy package. stick for the cheaters, those who take a commitment without a strategy, because the benchmark reveals those who increase the global climate risk for all. And this information should become very, very useful for financial regulators, also for private investors. And actually, I really encourage central banks to take a look at those benchmarks based on the ACT methodology, in particular after the very clear position taken by ECB, the European Central Bank, last week on the climate agenda. And companies that are increasing climate risk can be penalized in terms of refinancing condition or credit rating. This is a stick. And the carrots, for those who make effort, it can take the form of different instruments, for instance, white certificate schemes to encourage the development of energy efficiency services, and R&D subsidies to spur innovation. In France, we are about to launch a new program for investment for the future with several billions of R&D subsidies. And this support must be directed to companies that are truly committed to the transition. And the benchmark allows us to identify those companies. So we need to develop benchmarks in the oil and gas sectors, obviously, and many others to implement climate smart policies. And ADEME is really happy to bring its support to these efforts.
Thank you so much, Baptiste, for that context that you've provided, the historical context that actually shows that the benchmark is meeting a critical recognition gap. And I really appreciate this carrot and stick approach that you've described. Baptiste, I'm curious, as we wrap up your remarks, what's your call to action to the folks on this call today as they receive these benchmark results, as they really resonate with these key findings? What would you say is the role across sectors to play in advocating for these changes in the sector that you've described?
You mean, how do they receive the benchmark?
What can the people in this webinar today help do to realize the change that you've described in the sector?
Yeah, it's a totally new information, actually, because so far we just have a list of committed companies to net zero, but here we have, for the first time, a robust methodology to really appraise the means brought by companies to meet the objective. And the ranking that is going to be revealed next week will be very interesting to put pressure on the companies, and very interesting also for governments to better design their carrot and stick policy.
Awesome.
It's critical.
Thank you so much for really illuminating the critical nature of these benchmarks. Thank you for joining us today. And we'll circle to Patrick Heller now to share some brief remarks and get your insights on the key findings that we just heard. Patrick, a very good morning to you. I know it's early for you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Dustin, and thanks to the WBA for inviting me.
Absolutely. Patrick Heller is the advisor at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and we'd love for you to start with a question around challenges and opportunities for national oil companies to play a role in renewable energy and diversification. Curious if you can start us there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dustin. And I was really glad to see that the benchmarking was focusing especially and in particular on national oil companies along with other companies, because they're often left out of these kinds of conversations in spite of the massive role that they play in the oil and gas industry and in the climate crisis more broadly. So as Vicky said at the outset, most of the oil and gas in the world is produced not by the Exxons and the Shells and BPs of the world, but by state-owned oil companies. The majority of production, almost half of all spending in the sector, is done by national oil companies. And there's a pretty good chance that this share is going to grow going forward. A lot of the divestment efforts that we've started to see getting a little bit of traction with publicly traded oil companies haven't really picked up steam with state-owned companies in the same way. And so as people are looking at the future and speculating on what might happen, there's a big fear out there that as some privately held or publicly traded oil companies move away from the sector, national oil companies' roles are going to continue to grow, and their market share is going to grow. And so it's really critical at this point in time to think about the role that these companies can play, that they are playing now in exacerbating the climate crisis, and that they should be drawn upon to play in being part of the solution, or at least not as much of an obstacle. But in spite of that, like I say, we often, in debates around what oil companies can do vis-a-vis climate, we either don't hear about state-owned oil companies at all, or they're kind of held out there as a sort of specter. Somebody mentioned in the chat, people sort of use state-owned companies as a kind of way to argue against progress among others, because they say, oh, well, if we do this, then these other companies are just going to come in and fill the gap. And I think it's really critical to bring national oil companies into these conversations, both in the global climate conversation, but also for people within their countries to increase the pressure that they're putting on national oil companies to reform. I think the carrot and stick framing that Baptiste shared is really valuable. And just like with other kinds of oil and gas companies, I think there's a need for more pressure, both internally within the producing countries and on the global scene, but also for a stronger set of incentives and to help build opportunities for state-owned companies to reform and progress and move forward. So in one sense, the challenges and opportunities facing national oil companies are similar to those that my two previous speakers have laid out for all kinds of oil companies, right? Cleaning up their own productive processes, right? Reducing scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, reducing their investments in particular the dirtiest, most expensive, most climate unfriendly kinds of oil and gas projects, but more broadly speaking, reducing investment across the board. Investing for some national oil companies in clean energy. The opportunities and challenges in one sense are the same, but there's some core features of what these companies are or how they're constituted that makes the kinds of carrots and sticks that might be most valuable a little bit different, right? And I want to focus on two of those in particular. One is that these are the shareholders of these companies are the citizens of their countries, right? These are publicly owned companies. And that means that in many cases, they are right at the core of their national economies. So they are in many cases the biggest generators of public revenues, the biggest taxpayers, and they're intertwined in all kinds of ways with the fundamental management of their economic futures. And that makes reform hard, right? That means that these companies are right at the core of the entrenched oil and gas industry. And so reforming them, in one sense, there's one way in which it can be easier, right? Because they're controlled by their governments. If a government takes a really strong stance to change something about the way it manages the oil and gas industry, that connection between government and company is even tighter than it is for private companies. But in another sense, this makes it a lot more complicated, because changes, particularly in the ways in which state-owned companies are investing, hit right at the core of how these economies have been financed over time. And so thinking about reforms to state-owned companies requires thinking about reforms to the whole way in which the oil economy is structured. And so the challenge is big. I would say the second thing, just to mention it briefly, is the kinds of accountability mechanisms that have started to kind of emerge and poke through with some publicly traded oil and gas companies. We don't see them having the same kinds of power across the board with state-owned companies. So I wasn't shocked to see that the benchmarking reveals that state-owned companies tend on average to score lower, although there's massive diversity within the companies. Because public transparency is a challenge for many NOCs more broadly. And so I think this benchmark can be a big step in the right direction at creating stronger mechanisms for governments, company leaderships, but most importantly, the citizens that are the shareholders of these companies to increase the attention and the scrutiny that they're providing on what they're doing vis-a-vis the climate.
Patrick, thank you so much for those insights. I really appreciate you naming that internal and external pressure must be placed on these companies to realize this reimagining of the system that you've described. I'm wondering if we can connect this really tangibly to the benchmark. How can the insights and the data from the oil and gas benchmark support this advocacy and action that you described of national oil companies in the low carbon transition?
Yeah, I think it can be really valuable. I mean, my organization works all the time with governments in oil and gas producing countries, with NOCs, but also with activists, journalists, researchers within producing countries who want to know, okay, how do we think about what our economic future looks like and how that economic future connects to, the future of the planet, right? And the fight against climate change. But there's a huge diversity among national oil companies in terms of how they're structured, right? Some are publicly, some list some shares on public exchanges. Many are completely owned by the state. In terms of their skills, size, capabilities, and what often can obscure some of the debates and some of the pushes for more sustainable practices in these countries is people sort of saying, well, our situation is different, right? You can't look at the kind of global pressure on the industry and just apply it to what's happening within our national system. And I think that's right. And of course, looking at context is really critical. But of course, there are ways in which companies can learn from one another. And of course, there are ways in which pressure to perform can be brought to bear on the leadership of governments and on the leadership of companies. And so I look at the benchmark as an opportunity to crystallize real attention on the range of performance, to highlight that some national oil companies, as I imagine the findings will do, some national oil companies are starting to take serious action. It is possible, right? But also to lend a lot more specificity to the identification of where companies are falling short in their transition plans. And I think that can help, again, from this sort of outside-inside perspective, right? That can help people outside of the companies to say, okay, this is where we need to make a push, that stick that Baptiste was referencing. But it can also help people within the companies and within their government say, okay, listen, if we do want to make a change, where are changes possible, right? Where have others taken steps that we can build upon or that we can learn from? So I haven't seen the full results yet, but I'm looking forward to them, and I think they can be really valuable.
Patrick, thanks so much for that. And I appreciate the sense of appreciative inquiry that you're bringing to the benchmark, and really hoping that it creates the systems changes that you're describing. We'll now shift over to Tim Gold. Tim Gold is the head of Energy Supply Outlook Division at the International Energy Agency. Good afternoon, Tim. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Thanks a lot, Dustin, for the chance to speak with you today.
Absolutely. And as we have heard, the oil and gas benchmark is novel, right? It will be the first comprehensive assessment using the IEA's recently published 1.5 degree scenario. Would love to hear from you as a representative from the IEA. What are your expectations for this benchmark?
Well, to be honest, I expect that you'll find that we're a long way short of where we need to be in this area, as in many others. There's been a lot of talk in the run-up to COP26 about a 1.5 degree stabilization. But look at the world around us. Look at the energy data. 2021, in our view, is set to be the second largest rise in global CO2 emissions in history. We're seeing the data at the moment. The run-up in prices from oil and gas are, if anything, they're sending signals to companies to invest rather than to move away from hydrocarbons. So everyone, including policymakers, industry, finance, we need to get serious about the challenge that we face. We need to get serious about climate change. We need to close that really sharp division that we still have today between what people are saying and what we're seeing in the world around us. That's indeed why we did the work on this net zero by 2050 scenario, because net zero by 2050, very much part of the global conversation. but we felt that there was a bit of context missing. What exactly does that mean for the energy sector? What would it take to get a transformation of that scale? So that's why, at the invitation of the COP presidency, we wanted to fill in that detail about what it looks like to get serious about that kind of transformation. And there are some really striking data points in there. So if we do get serious, then within 10 years, 60% of the cars sold worldwide would need to be electric, or we'd need to be deploying 1,000 gigawatts of wind and solar each year, rather than the sort of around 250 that we are today. And if we start hitting those benchmarks, then obviously that's going to have massive implications for all sorts of things, but it's going to have massive implications for oil and gas demand as well. And that's why we get the finding, which has obviously been reported widely, that in that pathway, you could meet oil and gas demand only from fields that are already producing or that are under development today. So there's no need for new exploration or approvals. And that's obviously a very challenging scenario for the oil and gas industry. And I imagine that you'll highlight there's a whole lot more that companies could and should be doing. And I think the message there is pretty stark, that anyone from that industry who thinks that the pressure on the oil and gas sector will fade with time, or that they can wait and see before considering the implications for their company, they're clearly making a big mistake. So there's no part of the industry that will be unaffected, and every part needs to consider how to respond. And I've just listened to Patrick talk very well about the importance in this of national oil companies, amongst others. There's a pretty wide spectrum there, as he was hinting, but I couldn't agree more that they need to be part of this conversation. And as he was saying, this is not just a question of NOC strategies. This is a much broader issue about the role of hydrocarbons in national development in the countries concerned, the dependence on oil and gas revenue, the implications for citizens, and so on.
Tim, I appreciate that framing, and I'm wondering if you can help address a question that got raised in the chat. To what extent do fugitive methane emissions contribute to greenhouse gas emissions of the sector, and are the regulations planned in Europe and the US to address this strong enough? Would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a very good question. One of the striking things that we've found looking at this sector in our own work is, if you look at all energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, 15% of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions come from the process of getting oil and gas out of the ground and to consumers. So that's not the final combustion emissions. That's just all the stuff that's required before it gets to us as consumers. Now, 15% of the total energy-related emissions is a massive amount. I mean, that's roughly the same as today's emissions from the United States. So, and a lot of that has to do with methane leaks to the atmosphere. So we have been arguing very strongly that that is the single most important and cost-effective thing for the industry to do in the near term to bring down these emissions. It's, in our view, extremely cost-effective. And if you look at the difference today between the best performing companies and the worst performers, you can see, I mean, in a way, that's a depressing thing to do, just because you see the extent of the waste and the unnecessary, damage that we're doing to the environment today. But it's also potentially a hopeful message, in that it shows that there could be very cost-effective and quick ways to close those gaps. And there's more data becoming available from a wide variety of sources, especially from satellites, to be honest, but also from cheaper ground-based monitoring to try and improve the transparency on that. And one final thing on that, the question asked about, are the US and Europe doing enough? Of course, they're in slightly different situations. I mean, US is a major producer, and there are some regulations which we think are very important that are being reinstated at the moment that will deal with this at federal level. There are also some interesting things happening at state level in the US. But for Europe, the issue is really not, I mean, there are things that Europe can do internally, but Europe is a big importer. And so the big question for Europe is, can it leverage its position as a big importer of gas in particular to try and encourage those exporters to Europe to tackle this issue. And that's a big part of the EU methane strategy. In our view, there are very interesting possibilities for the EU to do things in that context. So one final issue on the methane side is, if you compare CO2 and methane, so CO2, obviously the larger contributor to global warming, but a gas that stays in the atmosphere for many, many decades, even centuries, and methane, much more short-lived in the atmosphere. You have to tackle both of them. But if you look at the coverage of these emissions today from country by country, you'll see that countries with net zero pledges, they cover around 70% of today's CO2 emissions, but they cover only about 30% of global methane emissions. So there's clearly going to have to be some strategies that are collaborative, cooperative, that bring also national oil companies into this discussion if we're going to manage the methane issue as well.
Tim, something that has been a theme throughout your remarks so far that's really resonating with me is the need for serious action, the need for collaborative and serious action. And one of the key findings is that we've seen industry-wide inaction. So I think a lot of a question that I'm resonating with, or a question that I think many of us share, is what can be done to incentivize the low carbon shift that you've described?
We've talked a little bit about this already. There's going to be push factors, there's going to be pull factors. I mean, the push is going to come from transparency. It's going to come from initiatives like the one that we're talking about today. It's going to come from youth. It's going to come from social expectations, which are transmitted to the companies in the societies in which they operate. And that is obviously going to be very important. But the pull factors, I think there you're talking about the opportunities to invest in a different kind of energy sector, in different fuels, in different energy carriers, in efficiency and so on. And there's clearly responsibility there on oil and gas companies, but there's clearly responsibility on other actors as well, including governments, to try and open up more of those possibilities in the future. But we try and track what the companies are doing. And also looking at their capex budgets and seeing how much of that is going into, in a sense, traditional oil and gas supply operations, and how much of it is going into non-core activities, so clean energy technologies and so on. And what we found, and I think it's even slightly lower than what was mentioned earlier on, is that as of last year, the sample of companies that we were looking at were investing around 1% of their capex annually into clean energy technologies. Now, that is starting to change, and there are some companies that are diversifying much more rapidly than others. In our view, tracking for this year, for 2021, shows that 1% for that group of companies is going up to around 4% this year. And really, for individual companies, it's starting to get well into double figures. But that's a journey which is just starting, and it's clearly one which we'll be watching very closely, because in the end, there are technologies that we know we're going to need, whether that's low carbon hydrogen or offshore wind or advanced biofuels or carbon capture, utilization and storage in some sectors, that are not a bad match for the skills and expertise and deep pockets and sort of engineering and subsurface knowledge of the industry. So those are the areas where we really think that the oil and gas industry can actually help with some of the more difficult aspects of energy transition.
Well, Tim, I just want to thank you so much for your time and for sharing an echo of this carrot and stick model that we've already described. And so grateful for your leadership at the International Energy Agency. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
At this point, we'll be transitioning to Nicolette Bartlett, inviting Nicolette Bartlett to join me on the virtual stage, who is the Executive Director at the CDP. Nicolette, how are you? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Dustin. And how are you?
I'm hanging in there. It's a little bit early in New York, but this is such an invigorating way to start my morning. Nicolette, I'm wondering if we can start with a high-level question again. How important is investment in low carbon technologies for the industry's future? It seems like a leading question based on the conversation that we've already had. Would love your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I think Tom just summed it up Tinder summed it up right at the end there about the pull factors, right? We're going to need, ultimately, this sector needs to transition, and it's the core way it needs to transition is to become part of the transition, is to actually provide the energy infrastructure that's needed for the future, right? So that's absolutely critical. And I would say that, when we looked at the CapEx in this, it was extraordinary to see. So I think the most important message that investors and other stakeholders have of companies right now, oil and gas companies, are we can see ambition, right? We can see aspiration, but what we don't know is what that means and what your plans are. So this report is really trying to assess against that. What tangible plans are actually out there? Because we need companies to set plans. Then we need them to disclose those plans, right, in detail, the information, so that we can assess as stakeholders whether they really are on this journey. Finally, investors will need those plans, not just stakeholders on this call, not just the youth, not just campaigners, not just governments, but investors absolutely need to see these tangible plans. And then more critically, we need to see them report against those plans. What's the progress against plans? And we're not even in the first stage of that journey yet. What we can clearly see from this analysis is that the details on the plans are just not there. And whether the companies have those plans and are just not disclosing, that's another story. But right now, we can clearly see that those indicators are just not there. Let's take a look at CapEx, for example. So in this future we're moving into, right, these companies could and should be transitioning to a place where they are able to support that by providing the technologies of the future. Now, that would seem to me that you would be aligning your CapEx plans with that future. Now, the IEA is very, very clear, to get us to where we need to be by 2030 on this 1.5 trajectory, we need to see 77% of the investment aligned globally with these new types of technology. So this benchmark looked from 2020 to 2024, it was looking at a 5-year period and saying, surely that is a good enough period for us to assess whether these companies have their capital expenditure aligned with that trajectory. And it's very clear they don't. You'll see the numbers when they come out, but as Vicky was showing, very small numbers of companies even tell us and disclose what those CapEx plans are. And then of those that disclose, no companies at the right level yet, not even close. So across the board, as Vicky said, this number on aggregate is really, really low. So to get there, this is one of the biggest indicators that we need to see speeding up. Secondly, we're not even seeing companies set commitments to align with those goals. So no company has talked about what their CapEx commitments will be between now and 2024. They may be telling us this year, but they're not telling us their future commitment and how they seek to align. So as I was saying, these emerging technologies and the research and development budgets, we really see not only companies, again, are not at all aligning with that future world and the investment then. So they talk about the technologies, but their actual R&D budgets are not focused on driving those. And secondly, of the companies that do tell us that they have, there's a very small group of companies where we have enough information even to be able to assess the proportion of their budget that's linked to low carbon. So again, lots of talk around what technologies are needed, the future that's needed, the role they can play, their net zero targets, but nothing specific around how they will actually be investing to make that happen. And there is no investor in the world that can be looking at that and think to themselves, this company's on a trajectory towards that future that they are outlining, because we simply do not have the tangible indicators to say so. From CDP's perspective, this is going to be critical. For the next, for the last 20 years, we've been really focused on what you can't manage what you don't measure. So we've been focused on driving transparency, driving the ability of companies and cities and states and regions to measure this type of information and these indicators, and then embedding that information within kind of key decision-making structures, whether it be corporate, investors, governments, cities, etc. And we also score companies against this. And that's why it's been such a delight to work over the last 5 years with the DEM. And as Baptiste mentioned, really, this was really forward looking at the time when a DEM had the vision, probably the only, ecological and energy agency globally to do that at the time, to focus on this is what's really going to be needed. We're going to need the finance sector, the governments are going to need clear assessments and benchmarks that allow us to look at whether a company is really on a journey. And as everyone has mentioned, this is the first time we've looked at the oil and gas sector. And the World Benchmarking Alliance really led the way in the creation of these benchmarks. Very exciting. I really hope people will be there listening to it next week, because I'm hoping that we can make an extraordinarily loud noise around this, really shine a light on what's happening and embed this within some of the kind of key levers around the world so that the pressure on the system starts to shift.
Nicolette, I really appreciate that comprehensive answer to walk us through your thinking around the benchmark and also your thinking about the sector as a whole. I would love to end on a high note, Nicolette. I'm curious, what's giving you hope? This entire webinar has been focused on sort of the stark realities. And I'm curious from your position at the CDP, what's giving you hope? What's giving you hope for a better, more sustainable future?
Absolutely. I think there's two key things. The notion that in such a short time, we've gone from, in Paris, the notion of net zero and the world getting to near zero, that what scientists were saying was what really matters, that to get us there it's going to take systematic decarbonization, not marginal, it has to be a transformation. Number two, 2 years later, the IPCC brings out a 1.5 paper that kind of gives us a shock as a community, where we'd all been talking and aligning around well below 2 degrees, 2 degrees, and that shock into the system. And within a very small space of time, you're starting to see that whole new ambition element coming in and standardizing. So the amount of companies who are now setting 1.5 science-based targets, for example, would have been unheard of 5 years ago in our community, 3 years ago when the IPCC came out with that report. And the fact that we now have an IEA scenario, right? And we have so many companies who've set net zero targets in this sector that we can actually assess against. We should always remember that. That would have been 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, we would have never guessed that there would be a world where landing with, here's companies have set these targets now, we need to see some plans, would even be something that we could say. We would still be lobbying for, them having targets in the first place. We're now talking about the implementation of those targets, and you can see investors tangibly leaning into this. You have initiatives like the CA 100 Plus and other initiatives, the focus on the World Benchmarking Alliance, and interest in our system, the World Benchmarking Alliance system, assessments on this. That shows you we are moving into a space of what you need to do into how you need to do it. And that for me is really exciting.
Nicolette, I just want to thank you for ending on that really beautiful note of not only acknowledging how much time or how much we still need to do, but also how much we've already accomplished in shifting some of the mental models in these corporations. Nicolette, thank you so much for your time. It has been a great pleasure speaking with you and speaking with all of our panelists today. I think a theme throughout our panelist discussions have been focusing on serious systemic action, focusing on collaboration across sectors, focusing on the importance of accountability. And I'm sure we can all agree the oil and gas benchmark is a critical piece to this puzzle. As our attendees have already noted in the chat, this has been energizing, this has been inspiring and nourishing, and it has been a wonderful honor to moderate this panel. I'll hand it over now back to Vicky Sins to close out our time together in this webinar. Vicky, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dustin, for your energizing words. And once again, I want to summarize this webinar that we just encouraged and we just discussed various topics around the upcoming benchmark that, as said, is launching on July 22nd, so next week Thursday, where you will know more of the insights into all the key findings that we just shared, but definitely also to look into the individual companies' performance and their ratings and rankings using this ACT methodology. As Dustin said, we truly need to see thought leadership, and that's what hopefully this tool that the benchmark will be will show how to take the next step in becoming that leader, because the tools are there to implement low carbon strategies and to really take the next step on this low carbon transition journey. It is really become now time to contribute to the challenges of these low carbon transitions, and it's therefore also the right time for us to hold these companies to account, because this is a very, very influential and important sector to really drive the transformation that we need to see. So it is really, as Nicolette said, it's very encouraging to see that companies are setting their targets, but we really need to see more and more ambitious targets, including all the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions that these companies are responsible for, and to really then show that what is the true risks that these companies are exposed to, and to really make sure that we bring together all the actors to drive the accountability. As mentioned by Patrick, we want to really be inclusive, to look at the state-owned and national oil companies, and therefore, as the citizens that are the shareholders of these NOCs, we really also find it very important to engage with the relevant civil society organizations that actually represent the voices of these citizens. And we therefore are a strong believer within the WBA that these societal expectations should be reflected into the call to actions towards these companies. You know, like Tim said, the need for strategies to be collaborative is absolutely crucial, because no one company can do this alone. And that's why the WBA is really striving for collective engagement to drive these actions that are required to achieve a low carbon economy. This collective engagement can only happen if we are coming together through our allies, through our partners, in really driving these engagement efforts forward. So I really want to encourage you to follow our work and get in touch if you want to continue to be engaged with various parts of our work, and to really make sure that we pressure on the system, like Nicolette said, to really shift towards this low carbon economy. So last but not least, I want to thank you all, the speakers, the participants, our partners, our allies, and everybody following our work.